Do you remember calling your friend's house on a landline phone and secretly praying their parents wouldn't be the ones to pick up? Do you remember the specific plasticky smell of a Blockbuster on a Friday night? And do you remember a world before the internet, but you can't really imagine living without it now? If you answered yes to all of that, then you are not a millennial, and you're definitely not Gen X. You are part of a lost micro-generation, born roughly between 1976 and 1985, that psychologists and sociologists are finally starting to understand. They call you Xennials, and your mind is one of the most unique psychological artifacts of the modern age. You see, you're not confused, you're a bridge. And that feeling of not quite belonging anywhere, that's your superpower. Your entire psychology is built on what experts call a Cusper Identity. You were born on the cusp of two completely different worlds. This means you're too optimistic for the deep, earned cynicism of Gen X, who grew up with grunge music and government distrust, but you're also way too cynical for the collaborative, sometimes naive idealism of the millennials, who were raised on social media and participation trophies. You get the jokes from both sides of the generational divide, but you're not fully a member of either club. It's a constant state of cognitive dissonance, a feeling of being a tourist in the present. But this isn't just a feeling, it's wired into your brain. Xennials possess a unique form of neuroplasticity because you had an analog childhood, but a digital adulthood. Your brain's core architecture was built in a pre-digital world, a world where you had to memorize phone numbers, navigate using a paper map, and focus on a physical book for hours without a notification popping up. Then, right in your late teens and early 20s, the most impressionable period for habit formation, the digital revolution happened. You adapted. You learned to code in MySpace HTML, you mastered Napster, and you were the first of your friends to get a cell phone that wasn't the size of a brick. This makes you, as sociologist Dan Woodman from the University of Melbourne describes it, a communications bilingual. You can seamlessly switch between the synchronous communication of Gen X, like a phone call, and the asynchronous world of millennials, like texting and DMs, without any stress. You're the IT support for your older relatives and the ancient history professor for your younger colleagues. That isn't a flaw, it's a feature. But there's a deeper, more painful layer to the Xennial mindset. It's a phenomenon I call delayed disillusionment. Unlike Gen X, who were promised Cold War anxiety and economic decay, you grew up in the relative peace and prosperity of the 1990s. The Berlin Wall fell, the economy was booming, the future felt safe. And then, just as you were stepping into adulthood, two things happened: 9/11 and the 2008 financial crisis. For you, 9/11 wasn't a historical event you learned about in school. It was the moment the world you knew died. You were at your first real job or in college, and you processed it with an adult mind. That event snapped the spine of your optimism. You remember the before times, and that memory makes the after feel so much more tragic than it does for younger generations who were born into it. This experience shaped how you build relationships. Research from the Pew Research Center highlights that Xennials were the last generation to date without a digital safety net. You met people in person with no ability to pre-screen their social media. You had to trust your gut. This has given many Xennials a lower baseline of social anxiety in face-to-face interactions compared to younger millennials who were used to vetting people online before ever meeting them. You know how to talk to strangers because for the first 20 years of your life, everyone was a stranger until you actually talked to them. In the famous Strauss-Howe generational theory, you fall at the tail end of the pragmatic, reactive generation and the very beginning of the civic-minded millennial generation. This explains why you're often such effective leaders and managers. You have the independent, problem-solving skills of Gen X, but you also understand the millennial desire for teamwork and a positive work culture. But it can also be lonely. You're the leader who doesn't quite have their own tribe. So you might find yourself feeling like an imposter. The world changes faster than you were taught to expect, but slower than you now know it can. The key is to stop trying to fit in. Embrace your role as the great generational translator. You are the only one who can explain a TikTok trend to the board of directors using an analogy from an episode of Friends. That is a rare and valuable skill. And because you vividly remember life before the internet, you're one of the few groups who knows what true mental quiet feels like. This is why an analog weekend, no phone, no GPS, just a book and a walk, doesn't feel like a radical detox for you. It feels like coming home. Of course, critics will say this is just nostalgia, that a few years of birth date can't create a whole new psychological profile, and they have a point. An Xennial from a wealthy suburb had a very different tech transition than one from a rural working-class family. But the shared cultural experience is undeniable. You are the Oregon Trail generation. You sat in a computer lab playing a game where technology was primitive, exciting, and often brutally unfair. It was the perfect metaphor for your life. You were given a set of tools that barely worked and told to find your way to a new world. And somehow, you did. You are the generation of the cassette tape and the pencil who understood that sometimes to move forward, you had to manually rewind. So, if you feel like an immigrant from a country that no longer exists, know that you're not alone. You successfully assimilated into this new, hyper-digital world, but you'll always speak its language with a slight accent. An accent that remembers the dial-up tone, the weight of a Walkman, and a time when boredom was not a crisis to be solved with a swipe, but an opportunity for your mind to wander.